The Karcsi Identity. Written, directed and performed in 13 episodes by Jesse Rowe.
Chapter 5. The Escape. The village was quiet. Too quiet. The streets were lined with quaint houses and small shops sprinkled in the snow. Karcsi ducked into an alley, his heart pounding. He had no idea where he was or what to do next. But he felt called, pulled in one direction, guided it seemed. His eyes seemed to be drawn, and it gave him an incredible headache, right in the middle of his forehead. He collapsed to the ground and held it as it throbbed. He knew he needed sleep. He couldn't survive without rest. Yet shivering, he needed somewhere warm. In the distance he spotted a train station at the end of the village and made his way there, keeping to the shadows. As he approached, he stepped aside as two policemen exited the station. The second turned and looked as two policewomen dragged a screaming woman dressed in black jeans and what looked like a homemade knitted jumper with two large eagles sat above a nest with a small chick inside. She was really screaming. Karcsi had to look away with awkwardness. It was unbearable. She was not happy. As Karcsi stood to the side, he noticed a dark van turn up, and the side door was opened and the woman was thrown in the back. The police officers followed her in, and then the door slammed shut and went off into the darkness. Wow, Karcsi thought to himself, what was that about? My goodness, he thought. He second-guessed himself and wondered if he should enter the station. He leant against the banister of the stairs up to the station door and lowered his forehead onto it, chilling his burning brow. He tried to comprehend what was going on. It felt like a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. He shook his head in the snow, wiped the powder off his hair and walked into the station. Once inside, he approached the ticket counter. Hesitating, the woman behind the glass smiled at him. "Guten Tag, wohin möchten Sie fahren?" she asked. To his surprise, Karcsi understood her perfectly. "Innsbruck," he replied without thinking, his voice steady and confident. He blinked in surprise, realizing he was speaking German, something he didn't know he could do. But most of all, he had requested a ticket to a place he had never heard of before. He opened his mouth and wiggled his jaw, then wiggled his nose. "I want my face back," he thought to himself. He giggled. The woman looked positively confused at him. "Was ist das?" she said firmly. Karcsi quickly shook his head and smiled, for she did hand him the ticket. He instantly stared at her. She felt embarrassed and looked down, and he boarded the next train heading west. As the train rumbled through the snowy landscape, exhaustion finally overtook him. He found a quiet corner and dozed off, the gentle rocking of the train lulling him into a fitful sleep. Karcsi awoke an unknown time later in a park by a large lake, the chill of the morning air seeping into his bones. He must have walked there in his sleep, unable to remember getting off the train. He stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness. He jogged on the spot and then dropped down and started to do push-ups. 1, 2, 3, 4, he shouted on each rise. As he was engrossed in his workout, he failed to notice two police officers standing above him. "Alles in Ordnung?" the fatter one asked, his tone suspicious. Karcsi felt a strange panic. He didn't know why, but he instinctively knew he couldn't trust them. Before he could think, his mind went blank, and the next thing he knew, both officers were on the ground unconscious, and he was holding their guns in each fist pointed at their still bodies, his hands trembling. He dropped the guns, horrified at what he had done. He quickly wiped his fingerprints off them, checked that the officers were still breathing, and then ran. He didn't understand how he had attacked them so easily, or why. He had felt such a surge of violence He ran from the lake and into the edge of a large town, with spires and towers poking up into the late night air. The wind howled through the narrow alleys, carrying with it the biting chill of a winter night. The snow-covered streets, lined with historic buildings and towering churches, lay silent under a thick blanket of white. The distant peaks of the Alps, cloaked in snow, stood as silent sentinels over the city, their icy presence palpable, even in the dark. He shuffled through the snow, his breath coming in quick, frosty puffs. Wearing nothing but a thin t-shirt and a pair of jeans, he wrapped his arms around himself in a vain attempt to ward off the cold. His small, trainer-clad feet crunched softly with each step, leaving a trail of uneven footsteps behind him. He reached a narrow, poorly lit alleyway at the back of a cheap, dimly lit hotel. The windows on the lower floor were dark, save for the occasional flicker of a television screen. A single window, slightly ajar, caught his eye. He reached up, fingers numb with the cold, and pushed it open just enough to squeeze through. He landed softly on the floor in the restaurant's storage room, the scent of stale bread and onions filling the air. His breath steadied as he took in his surroundings, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows. The kitchen was just beyond the storage room, and the clatter of pots and pans, coupled with the murmur of voices, reached his ears. He knew he had to be quiet. Moving stealthily, he crept towards the doorway, peeking out to gauge the scene. The kitchen staff, absorbed in their late-night preparations, moved about with practiced efficiency, their backs mostly turned away from him. He waited for a lull in their movement, then darted silently across the tiled floor. He pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding in his chest, every muscle tensed as he listened for any sign that he had been detected. The chefs continued their work, oblivious to his presence. Slowly he inched his way along the corridor, his senses heightened, each creak of the floorboard sounding like a thunderclap in his ears. He paused at the base of the stairs, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. He stood peering around to the front desk where the receptionist was on his phone playing some sort of racing game. Behind him was the row of keys. Many were taken, but the key fob to room 645 was in a small basket that said "Approuvage." He instantly assumed that meant departures. Satisfied that he was still undetected, he ascended the staircase to floor number 6, each step taken with painstaking care. At the top of the stairs, the dimly lit corridor stretched out before him. The worn carpet muffled his footsteps as he moved from doorway to doorway, finally reaching door 645. It creaked open under his tentative push. He slipped inside, closing it softly behind him. The room was dark save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the thin curtains. It was sparsely furnished, a bed, a small table, and a chair the only occupants. Exhausted and shivering, he crossed the room to the bed, his legs feeling like lead. Cigarette stains were on the bed sheets and carpet. They must have left recently, as the smell of tobacco still lingered in the air. He climbed onto the mattress, its worn springs creaking under his slight weight. The bed sheets were creased, and he pulled them off and curled into a ball on the bare mattress. He reached under the bed. Sliding it open, he pulled out a neatly folded thin blanket over himself. Its rough, burlap, potato sack texture, a small comfort against the cold that had seeped into the inner parts of his bones. His eyelids grew heavy, the adrenaline that had kept him going finally ebbing away. As he drifted off to sleep, his mind lingered on the fear that someone might still be following him. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift and whisper. But for now, he was safe. The darkness, the cold, and the silent, snowy night outside could not reach him here. He woke up some unknown time later, again not knowing. It was dark then, and still dark now. There was no knowing, in these winter months, when sunrises or sunsets are, those daylight hours that bring joy. His clothes were still dirty and smelly. As he stripped off his shirt to wash his face and armpits, he noticed his shirt was stained in blood. He had no idea if the blood was his or someone else's. He fell instantly asleep again. The boy awoke with a start, the unfamiliar room slowly coming into focus. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the thin curtains. It was still night. The silence was profound, save for the distant hum of the city beyond. He glanced around, his eyes landing on the signs and labels scattered around the room. They were all in German. He furrowed his brow, trying to piece together his location. Central Europe seemed the most plausible. Germany, Austria, Switzerland. He shook his head, attempting to clear the fog of confusion. His amnesia was a cruel fog, obscuring his name and past. The chill in the air, the landscape, the architecture, all pointed somewhere to Central Europe. How did he know German so perfectly? Maybe, he thought, maybe he was German. He thought he was British, but perhaps not. But he spoke German without a hint of an accent. That takes time and practice to make perfection. Where was he? And why did he feel an inexplicable pull, a driving urge to be somewhere, and yet somewhere he didn't know where? He swung his legs off the bed and stood up straight, and then hunched over. Each step towards the bathroom felt heavy laden with uncertainty and dread. He still had the blood-stained shirt in his hands. The harsh bathroom light flickered on, casting an unforgiving glow. He stared into the mirror, his reflection showing a face he hardly recognized. His cheeks and forehead had been heavily bruised, remnants of some ordeal on the snowy mountain. That was what he had seen in the mirror at the ski chalet. But now the bruises were gone, as if they were never there. When had he been on the mountain? How long had he been asleep? Tentatively, he pinched his finger, testing his senses. No blood. He pulled open the drawer under the sink and slammed it on his finger. The pain was sharp, immediate, but he remained detached, almost clinical. He withdrew his finger and watched in horrified fascination as it turned red, then purple, green, and then black, before returning to its normal colour within seconds. His heart pounded, a mix of fear and amazement surging through him. Kicking off his right shoe and peeling off his sock, he braced himself. Stretching his leg back, he paused, reconsidered, then removed his left shoe and sock. He swung his leg hard against the wall, wincing at the sickening crunch. His toes crumpled, twisted in grotesque shapes, yet he felt only a dull throb. Within 30 seconds they reshaped, the bruising fading, as if by magic. He hopped on his foot, testing its strength, staring at his reflection in disbelief. Who was he? He exhaled into the mirror, fogging up a patch of glass, and pressed his index finger against it, leaving a distinct print. He repeated the process slightly to the right on the mirror. Comparing the two, he saw that they were different. How? He inspected his fingerprints closely, noticing the lines shifting slightly. He bit down hard on it, and the movement ceased. Dizziness washed over him, and he splashed cold water on his face, the chill cutting through his confusion. The momentary clarity was shattered by a wave of nausea. He stumbled to the toilet, lifting the lid, and vomited. His body convulsed, each heave racking his frame. He gasped for breath, scrambling back to the sink to rinse his mouth and face. Lifting his shirt to dry his mouth, he was reminded of the bloodstains on the back, hardened and dark. They told a story he couldn't remember. He twisted his body to inspect his back. No cuts, no wounds. Whose blood was it? His or someone else's? The mystery deepened, each answer eluding him. In the back of the shirt, there was one solitary tear, just in the middle of the bloodstain. Desperation clawed at his mind as he splashed water on his face again, trying to stay grounded. He dipped his blood-stained shirt into the sink, swirling it around to wash out the evidence of whatever had happened. The water turned pink, then red, spiraling down the drain. He stared in the mirror, droplets of water clinging to his skin. The reflection staring back was that of a stranger. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, and he clenched the sink's edge, feeling the cold porcelain against his skin. The answers had to be out there. As he pondered his next move, there was a sudden knock on the door. Karcsi froze, his heart racing. Tiptoeing across the room, he looked through the peephole. His blood ran cold. Standing outside were 11, 12, 13, 14 armed SWAT team members. Their faces hidden behind helmets and visors, their weapons drawn and ready. Two of them stepped forward, a battering ram in hand, ready to break down the door. Karcsi's mind raced. He had to get out of there. He quickly grabbed his boots from the bathroom floor. He shoved his feet into them, his heart pounding in his chest, and opened the bathroom window. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he didn't hesitate. He climbed out, the sound of the door being battered down echoing behind him. He gripped the icy ledge tightly. The 6th floor was a long way up, but each room had a balcony, his potential lifeline. With a deep breath, Karcsi lowered himself down, his feet finding purchase on the metal railings of the balcony below. The SWAT team burst into his room just as he dropped, their shouts muffled by the closed window. He couldn't stop now. He scrambled over the railings and leaped to the next balcony, landing with a jarring thud that sent pain shooting up his legs. He bit back a cry, knowing the slightest sound could give him away. Snow clung to his clothes as he continued his descent, each balcony presenting a new challenge. One had a rusted railing that creaked ominously under his weight. Another was piled high with snow. The city below seemed to draw closer and closer, but so did the voices of his pursuers. At the 3rd floor he paused to catch his breath, the cold air burning through his lungs. The balcony doors were locked, but he spotted a drain pipe just within reach. With a determined grunt, he swung his wet shirt around one hand and then flicked the end around the other and grabbed hold of it and slid down, the rough metal scraping the shirt and barely hurting his hands. The shirt was so torn he could not use it again. He tossed it off the balcony into the snow below. It was only after he did this that he remembered there was someone's blood on it, his, or someone else's, but whoever it belonged to, it could be traced back to him, surely. As he landed on the 2nd floor balcony, a large crash echoed from above. They were on the move again, and faster this time. Panic surged through him, but he forced it down. "Focus, boy, focus," he said to himself. "You could do this." The final drop loomed before him. The ground was blanketed in snow, but it was still a perilous height. He glanced back up at the windows, the torches now visible as beams cutting through the darkness. Without another thought, he jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. Time stretched, the world went silent. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring but softened by the snow. He rolled to his feet, the cold biting at his skin, and took off running. The city's narrow, winding streets offering a labyrinth escape route. The shirt! But it was too late. He was gone too far to go back now. The mountain stood watch over him as he fled into the night, his memory still a blank slate, but his instincts sharp and unyielding. He would find answers. He would. But first, he had to survive.